He did a talk on this.
I don't even know.
Oh, we'll move on.
That was 4 days ago. I barely remember.
No,
it was a web portal. It was slick. I don't remember the name of it.
Welcome to another episode of my podcast. This one was actually recorded offline, not on our usual live stream, because we were at KubeCon North America in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I loved it so much, bought the hat. We had a little bit of vacation before and after, so this was a 10-day trip. My wife came with me, also my business partner, and Nirmal and I were recording on site on the last day of KubeCon, and we basically hung out at the booth because he had to work the booth at AWS after that. So we just covered everything we could think of in terms of engineering trends. So please enjoy this episode with Nirmal and myself talking about KubeCon.
Hey, I'm Brett.
Hey, I'm Nirmal.
And we're at KubeCon, Cloud Native Con in, where are we?
Lake City, Utah, 2024, KubeCon North America. We've been here, this is day number 3, the last day of...
Although for us, day 6.
Yes, day 6. Like most KubeCons, there was day 0 events, the co-located events on Tuesday.
Lots of those, so many of those.
And
Backstage, Argo, I think there was an AI one, observability. Was there a networking? I think it was like a eBPF and Cilium one, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm forgetting. Wasm was day -1, and then day -2 and -1 were also rejects, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
If you can get to come to KubeCon, just fly in a couple days early if you can. Go to rejects.
Yeah.
The thing about rejects, and this is my first one.
What's the thing about rejects?
My first rejects. I'm always missing it. Rejects is a chance for you to be with a couple hundred people, and a lot of them are OG, original Kubernetes maintainers, people that, it's very...
It's in this community.
Yes. Yeah, because when you're in this place...
I have seen some things.
Yeah. Here, we got 9,000 people, and it keeps getting bigger every year. So there, with a couple hundred, you're getting the same quality, some would argue sometimes even better quality talks, because it's a small room.
Well, let's say...
I'm not saying...
Not quality talk.
I'll say that.
The interactivity is higher. Yeah. The audience... camaraderie.
Yeah, and there's only 2, sometimes there's just 1 track, sometimes there's 2 at Rejekts.
Yes.
And it's free. It's great. Honestly, I have no notes for them. Keep doing what you're doing.
So did you go to Cloud Native Rejekts?
I did this year. I did day 2. I was driving there on day 1.
Okay.
From Moab. Took a little vacation because I knew this was going to be a long week.
Yeah, but so what was one of the sessions you saw at Cloud Native Rejekts?
The Microsoft VM replacement. They announced it on stage today.
A boot seat?
Something, or it was like a mini VM, smaller than VMs. So
not KubeVirt.
No, it's a new thing, a brand new thing. So I saw twice different takes on better abstracting our containers without going all the way to VMs, like without going Firecracker.
Somewhere between a container.
Yeah. It's a kind of weird space. I don't quite understand it yet, but it's better than namespaces. So like one of the challenges with namespaces that was showed off several times was all you need is one privileged container that somebody deployed, and now that container can do everything on every other container, see every other secret, see every other environment variable.
Yeah.
And
so that's why you have to be careful with privileged containers.
Pro tip. And so we saw multiple demonstrations, 2 different companies, with the idea of something that's a little bit better with the kernel than namespaces. One of them seemed to imply they were shipping a mini kernel. They didn't say unikernel.
Awesome. So there's evolution with respect to the container is not settled as like the only isolation mechanism.
I wouldn't even say that. I wouldn't say the container. I would say the namespace and C groups, or specifically the namespace approach that we use with the Linux kernel, is challenging when you're a platform engineer and you're hosting for all the departments on multi-node clusters. You need sometimes better isolation at the namespace layer, especially if you have a lot of infrastructure with privileged equals true, and that as we get more complex and we run everything on Kubernetes, maybe namespaces isn't appropriate for everyone, but maybe you don't want to run a VM per container. Right? So I think stay tuned, because these are all very experimental. They're very early days. I feel like they're just beginning. They're just being announced. So it's not, I wouldn't say this is anything near production yet, but we may be talking about something in the middle, a 3rd level of abstraction right between namespace, Linux kernel, and VM level isolation with full kernels, and all that stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the interesting things from Rejekts.
Yep.
And then we got day 0. what was one of the awesome things about day zero? Which one of the co-located?
Well, I got to go see you again in day zero. So we actually saw each other for the first time in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And that was a highlight. And then always, so day zero, like I kind of hopped around. I actually got to see Victor Farsick do some demos, a tool, and I don't even remember the name of it. But Victor, if you haven't seen, you know Victor Farsick, DevOps Toolkit, up, down, yeah. He's a cross-plane guy. And he always has fun talks. He's just so fun. He was actually running around so like the people were supposed to ask questions on the mics, but they were too lazy. So he was jumping off the stage and he's like, okay, I'm going to go up with it. Nobody wants to go to the microphones. And so he runs up to people, he listens to their question, then he runs back to the stage and answers their question. He's hilarious. So he's a friend. I consider him a friend. He's a great guy.
Nice. We were actually on this podcast recently.
Yeah, and he's been on ours. So we're back and forth.
So check out the DevOps Paradox podcast that I did with Victor.
Yeah, and the DevOps Toolkit YouTube channel, which is where he puts up look, if you're watching our show, you've probably seen this.
But yeah, so he did a talk on this.
I don't even know.
Oh. We'll move on.
That was 4 days ago. I barely remember.
No worries.
It was a web portal. It was slick. I don't remember the name of it.
No worries. BackstageCon was big, and there's a lot of interest there. I think Backstage is turning out to be the main kind of interface that platform teams are providing to developers.
Yeah.
We saw some new features about easier integration with AI-based interfaces to your environments. Backstage has access to a lot of data sources and information around the platform itself, and so we're seeing the evolution of different interfaces with respect to Backstage and ways to provide self-service to your developers if you're building a platform, or ways for you to enable guardrails or documentation, etc.
Yeah.
As a platform team. So that was big. BackstageCon was big.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that it has its own dedicated day. I mean, look, there's I think over 200 CNCF projects now.
Yes.
There's only 6 or 7 that get their own dedicated day in addition to the main conference. So if you make your own conference there, you are already big time, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Now, one thing about Backstage that I'm interested in is it's definitely now becoming a central access point for doing all the good and potentially bad things. So I'm sure there's been talks on like how to secure the crap out of it and how to do least privilege on all the things it can do.
Yeah.
But it's already to me feeling like if I'm a bad actor, this is the number thing I want, because everybody was talking about the Kubernetes API before. That was like the big worry, that and generally just node access. So Backstage is one of these projects where it has a risk of like almost like Kubernetes itself, with where we want to hit, it's a hammer and we want everything to be a nail, right?
Right.
So
do you think it's like is it necessarily the right thing all the time?
I don't think so. So there's another project we mentioned on the show recently, Headlamp, and Headlamp is directed, it started out as an idea, and I think Microsoft was a primary.
No,
there's a community of it, but
yeah, Headlamp was created by the same people that we had on the show on Inspector Gadget.
Oh, really?
CNCF project.
But we haven't done it. We haven't had a show on it, have we?
On Headlamp, no.
No, I don't think we have.
No, we did one on Inspector Gadget.
Yeah, I feel like we talked about it for a minute.
Yeah.
And I then recently had an audio-only podcast. Check out our audio-only podcast, because sometimes it's different than the video podcast. Not confusing at all. So sorry. Content synergy is a thing, but on the audio podcast, I did a little monologue breaking down all the Kubernetes UIs. And I mentioned Backstage, but I didn't even talk about it because I felt like it wasn't operationalized. Like, it's not specifically targeting ops, right? Even though I can do that, it feels like it was meant for like dev first.
Yeah, so they're like GitOps, and GitOps, the Git repo is like your interface, right? And one of the interfaces. But I know what you mean. There's kind of like a split here. There's the user interface and user experience for the developers, users of your platform. And then there's the UIs for the operators, like the SREs, the platform engineers. And sometimes those are the same.
Sometimes one person. So solo demo,
you run it, right. On the operations side, you have things like Grafana for observability, you have Backstage, parts of Backstage that are like the templating and the operational.
You can do whatever you want. Like, want to build it, you can do it.
And you have things like maybe Headlamp or things like Headlamp. They're meant for kind of low numbers of clusters.
Well, it is early days too, right? Headlamp's pretty early.
True, but I don't think you're going to be like logging into 100 clusters
right.
with Headlamp to make changes versus having some like more holistic solution that sees multiple clusters.
Right.
That's another theme we'll get to as well.
I think Argo, like Argo CD, starts to fill in that space of being able to do not cluster ops, but definitely app ops and like deployment ops in there and multi-cluster with that. They're pretty good at that.
I don't think we've ever said this, but Argo CD is it. Like, everyone is using it.
Yes,
It is the main thing that
I think like if you start building that stack, we talk about stacks a lot, right? Stacks, like, okay, everybody starts with Kubernetes and then you have 1,000 choices on top of that.
Yeah.
At least we've all made one choice for now, Kubernetes.
Yes.
But on top of that, right, we're starting to see the graduated project stack of like Cert Manager. Well, of course, you got to choose your proxy, but I feel like Envoy is coming in as the big dog now. Like they were the underdog before, but now it's like Envoy by default, I feel like.
Yeah.
And then, because a whole bunch of different products use it, and you start to build up that stack. But Argo CD tends to be the deployment dashboard.
I mean, I've been here for 3 days, talking to different customers, talking to people here. If I mention GitOps or how they're deploying,
Yeah.
80% of the time, Argo CD. The other 20 is, I don't know, I need some advice on what to do.
Or Flex. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, not
No,
much.
I've seen it. I've seen teams doing both, and the argument that the engineer gave me was Flux for our infrastructure, Argo CD for our developers.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
my friend and colleague, Carlos Santana, shout out, he's been working on a project called the GitOps Bridge, which is to help with that exact thing. So a lot of platform engineers are using Terraform for their infrastructure and to get the cluster up and maybe all the other things around. And then there's a transition to the GitOps part, like the stuff that's on the cluster. And so he has a project called the GitOps Bridge to bridge the infrastructure as code tooling to the GitOps side, right, Argo CD, for that exact kind of interface, because that's a little bit tricky. And you get into like chicken and egg kind of situations of in terms of like, you need this piece of infrastructure to exist for that resource to be deployed in Kubernetes, and then you need that thing in Kubernetes to exist to do something. And then
Now you have to dance the order of things, and you have to start serializing it.
right. And so that's one pattern we're seeing. And then the other one is more like the cross-plane, ACK. There's another one I can mention that at AWS just open sourced 2 days ago called Crow.
How you spell it?
KRO.
KRO. Yeah. Okay.
Good question.
Yes. I'm assuming there was a K in there.
Kubernetes Resource Orchestrator. That's a different approach to what I'll say is using Kubernetes native APIs to manage all of that. So not only the resources on the Kubernetes cluster, obviously, but your infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
So those are two patterns. Like most folks and most conversations are around, using Terraform for the infrastructure layer, getting the clusters up there, and then, getting Argo on there, and then Argo does its thing.
Right.
And then the other one is like the more advanced, having like a main cluster, a cluster of origin, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
That has like the Argo, has ACK, crossplane, that kind of stuff. And then it's using Kubernetes APIs to then provision.
Yeah. For like the ops cluster or the provisioning cluster or the main cluster, or everybody's probably got different names.
The
We
transition.
don't have a name in the industry for that, do we? Like the cluster of clusters, like the cluster that
I like the origin cluster.
origin cluster.
I mean, like the seed cluster.
Yeah.
Like
The origin of the universe, like the origin.
the Big Bang cluster. I love it. I'm going to say it right now. We're going to call that the Big Bang cluster.
Quicksand cluster. Big Bang cluster.
And then from there, and this is one of the themes we're going to talk about, which is we're now in fleet management.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That is a thing.
Right.
So there's folks here that are trying to build up platforms on the smaller side.
Yeah.
Doing the Terraform, doing the Argo. We're getting into that. And then there's a really big chunk of folks that are provisioning hundreds, if not thousands of clusters, each with hundreds, if not thousands of nodes. And there's a difference in those patterns. Like the tool thing.
Right. You can't, at that scale, you can't do any one. It's kind of like the old days where we talked about, when we first started having orchestration, we were talking about, we used to just SSH into a machine. We didn't even call it a node. We would call it an instance, and we would SSH into it. And we're like, now we have this thing so you don't have to do that. And now we have the thing on the things so that you don't have to manage one cluster's UI or kube control itself. In fact, you probably don't even have access to those anymore. And this is a central one Because Argo CD also does a lot of that, right? You can deploy it in one, it has a pattern where you can put it in one Argo and it pushes it to other Argos.
Yep. And we're seeing that a lot of the tooling here is adapting to this new fleet, kind of having more of a multi-cluster awareness, integration, and a lot of the trying to solve the challenges of that scale. Because then networking becomes really tricky, right? And upgrades and
Between regions, between clusters,
and service-to-service communication, knowing what's talking to what, where, and all that. So that's where a lot of like and I would say advanced conversation is around.
Yeah, because like not everybody's doing that, right? Like just to be clear, like you don't have to do that. And in fact, actually I heard Ford Motor Company talking publicly to the press about their Kubernetes experiences, and they have a general rule of we don't adopt most tools because they are so deliberate about simplicity, even if it means hand-built automation in-house. They don't want to keep adding more tools to their stack, and they just feel like that adds additional risk and complexity. So they intentionally don't do certain things, even though there's a slick new thing out, a new project that might do that. They won't adopt it. They have to be very deliberate, because if you walk around here, it can be very enticing to let.
There's so many new things.
So many new things. I saw a quick shout out. I'll find it later. We'll put it in the show notes. But a quick lightning talk at Rejekts was a great little idea. He had a Kubernetes RBAC tool. It was a command line driven tool that you could basically one line, without having to know exact definitions of thing, one line, someone getting access to as granular permissions of a thing as you want for a certain amount of time. So what I was seeing was
Time box.
like a one-liner that's like, give this person access for the next 12 hours to the logs of this pod.
Oh, interesting.
And then boom, and it's done. And then you don't have to come back, you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to go,
So absolutely. So the fleet picture and the challenges of that scale, to your point, like what it seems like Ford mentioned, there is an open source community called CNOE, CNOE for short.
Okay.
The Cloud Native something.
Okay. You want to be in the show notes?
CNOE.io. This is a community of end users of Kubernetes that looked at the big CNCF landscape and was like, enough is enough, but let's make some opinions about each category of, what should we focus on with respect to security? Yeah. And it's an opinionated community, and they're making reference architectures with the opinion.
Like the LAM stack, they're recreating the LAM.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's a perfect analogy. And it also has some other tooling, some really cool tooling called the IDP Builder. So if you are watching this and you're sitting there and you're trying to figure out, this, 200 plus tools out there.
Yeah.
And I feel even the ML AIs.
And that's not any of the SaaSes, that's not any of the paid products. That's the open source.
It's giving you a headache just looking at that eye chart, and you want to kind of know what are most people doing?
Yeah.
Check out the CNOE.io reference architectures and the IDP Builder. You can kick the tires.
Absolutely check it. I didn't know about that. I'm checking that out.
And it's a community of end users, and they meet together. They're companies that build platform or that have platforms internally. Before CNOE, they were individually going to these different communities, going, Argo, I want this feature, or we should push for this. And then when they started talking, they realized, hey, we have a lot of similarities in terms of like what we want from these tools.
Yeah.
We want to make some opinions about it. So instead of one-off, like working in the upstream on these different initiatives, let's like prioritize and solve each other's problems in a community. And so there's an open community around that. They meet regularly and they create reference architectures on the solutions. And there's also some tools. So check that out. But that's like a reaction to what you were saying, right? Like, whenever we come to KubeCon, how many new things?
Right, and the biggest questions I get from there's like the clients I advise and people that the students that are starting to adopt Kubernetes in their companies. That's the biggest question I get is around interoperability, stack preferences. What is essential, nice, and unnecessary, or someday maybe
like needs.
Yeah, needs and wants.
Yeah, needs versus wants. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, that does not mean that the innovation is stopped. it's like we have OPA and Caverno and, Gatekeeper, and just as one example, that doesn't mean like policy has been solved.
Right. I lean to the Kyverno side. They've also been on our show at least once, maybe twice, but I lean to that side because it feels like less. It feels like less work, I don't have to be an expert in everything I'm applying. I'm not throwing shade. It's just that it's a different group of people. Someone who's maybe they're not dedicated to policy management. It's just sort of one of the many roles they're assigned with, and they need sort of drag and drop out of the box policies. So I really dig that with Kyverno. Go.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that's the only one. At the scale of multiple clusters, security is becoming a little bit more challenging. And I think we're seeing a lot of different ways of approaching how to automate and secure these environments with respect to authentication, authorization, service communication. And so some folks are using things like Cilium, and a BPF approach to as part of it. The network policy is a network policy. Then there's like the authentication, authorization, and policies of the resources on the cluster. So that's where a lot of the challenge is right now with respect to scaling out.
And to agree with you, I heard the CNCF CTO, Chris, well, I'm not gonna say his last name because I always mispronounce it, so I need to practice it. So I was in a media analyst panel where they were giving out some hard stats about end user feedback in the CNCF community. And what I thought was actually surprising was security wasn't number one. I'm not even sure it was number two. It was probably number three. But number one was interoperability. And when they did that there was Adobe and Ford and all these big companies up on stage, sort of end user feedback kind of thing. And they all were nodding their heads like, yes, we really need more of that. We need these tools to just act as if they're all one giant tool together. I don't want to manage 20 different things separately. I need less. We need to start having these tools actually be able to control the other tool in more ways. I mean, obviously that's very challenging.
Interoperability even between the CNCF projects.
Right.
Like one example of it and probably working well right now is that most of these tools expose Prometheus style metrics.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's because Prometheus is an OpenTelemetry and Prometheus are CNCF projects. And that kind of is like the default way of exposing metrics, right? Even from the Kubernetes. But more like that, right? Like they are aware of how to talk to each other.
Yeah.
In operable ways.
The specific challenge right there, I'll give an example, is like you want to add a new tool, or maybe you want to add a new app, and you end up with this checklist. We all end up with checklists, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a human failable, human error kind of style where, okay, I want to do this thing. Okay, I need a new Kyverno policy for it. Okay, I need a new application set for that Kyverno policy. And then I need this on top of it, and I need to do this. You have all, and then, obviously that ends up with 1,000 lines of YAML, and you just wanted to really deploy a database and a web app. You just needed that, but you end up with so many different steps that you're checking off along the way. And maybe 5 years in the future, AI might help with that and be like, oh, did you, like Clippy will show up on, Microsoft Clippy will show up and say, hey, did you know that you needed a policy?
I think it will be Brady.
Yeah, okay. Or maybe, or GitHub Actions that will check to make sure that, hey, you did this thing, but in order for, the validations of like, we know of linting, like linting is a common GitHub action check, but maybe like all these other factors and checks that are saying, hey, look, you can put this in there, but I looked at this other repo and I don't see your matching set thing over there. And eventually we're going to get to hopefully the point where it says, would you like me to create that? Of course, GitHub would love for that to be their AI to say, hey, but maybe make a PR for you, but we're not quite there yet.
So speaking of AI, this will come as no surprise to anyone who's watched the show or been following.
Enter the second segment of the show.
So this would come no surprise to anyone who's watched the show or been watching the community and announcements. All the vendors we're seeing here are rapidly integrating Gen AI features into their tooling. So if you're a observability tool, there are now Gen AI features to, as they're collecting like all the log information from all your clusters and apps, where you can use Gen AI and talk to that system for troubleshooting, hey, what's my top talker? Why did this pod go down? What's the crash backhoe loop about? And also giving guidance on resolution. If you're a security tool, you're doing the same for CVEs and remediation. And
Docker showed off last night, Docker AI, which is a command line tool to help you, like not just search docs, but also make the files, help give you the recommendations, the best practices for your stuff. Yeah.
So the established vendors are rapidly integrating Gen AI or AI kind of capabilities and features that are enhancing the operations of what our other tool is doing.
And I would say, because I know we got lots of opinions on AI, right? And you're watching, you're either all in, you're somewhere in the middle. Like I call it AI eventually, and then like you're like, nope, none for me. I don't want that. I want humans in control. But in general, over all the AI stuff, I generally see it as a read-only paradigm right now. Like the AIs aren't necessarily going and making decisions for you. Yeah, I mean, there's exceptions, but in general, it's mostly just helping the human, or giving advice to the human, or helping you find things faster.
So human in the loop still.
Yeah.
From our old
Human in the loop.
public sector.
Also a good podcast name. Human in the loop.
But it's still human in the loop, but I don't know, like there's probably some tools out here and some companies that are doing ones that will actually, you give that agent access to the kubectl or whatever it is and can do those actions on your behalf.
Right.
And it could even just be read-only in the sense that it can run a command to grab more data and more context.
Are you saying soon I'll be able to ask Siri to replace that node?
I'm sure that will come eventually. And if
That's a good demo. Somebody make that demo.
So that's one part. The other part of AI is the building of AI, right?
Yeah.
Building of machine learning.
Yeah.
And that was part of the huge, right? So Kubernetes is now, I would say, the established way to run training and inference at scale.
Yeah.
I think NVIDIA was on stage talking about things that they're doing.
All their the evolution of their drivers and open source.
Yeah, that's in there. Yeah. But the advent of more machine learning, the advent of Gen AI has highlighted some of the very sharp edges with respect to compute, drivers. We used to, when we were doing containers, we were kind of very higher level of abstraction.
Yeah.
And
drivers weren't.
Yeah, you're barely even talking about the operating system with the host.
I would specifically say the difference between a container and a VM is a container doesn't need a kernel or drivers. Now I'm not sure I can say that.
Right. And so I think, back to what you were saying earlier in the show, there's this because of these sharp edges, I think there's a push for this in between of a container and a virtual machine. There's a lot of exploration there. And now the hardware matters again.
Right. I might just say, you heard it here first, I might just say that GPUs seem to be the hardest piece of infrastructure hardware in the last decade. Like, we've got CPUs down pretty good. We're pretty good at CPUs, memory, and storage, right? We define it. Yeah. We've got driver, we've got CSI, we've got CNIs, we've got these things.
Hot take. Okay. A hot take. I kind of agree. I would actually extend that because of that, now even CPU, memory, network, storage is now is having to respond to that because that's still in the mix, right? Good. So yes, GPU is hard, but you now also at scale, if you just have one GPU, sure, but we're seeing these big clusters, multiple GPUs. So that means that sharing storage, sharing networking, memory bandwidth, running models that are large.
I heard InfiniBand and the Keynote more than I've ever heard at a Keynote. They kept saying shit.
And it was all these things that were kind of maybe was more in the HPC world or 15 years of spoke niche kind of worlds is now, part of the conversation here at the Kubernetes level even, and understanding, storage with Kubernetes was not always the easiest thing to do.
Sure.
And I would argue still kind of a challenging place.
They reminded us on 1.0 that Kubernetes didn't even have storage. So.
Correct. Yeah. And so this machine learning use cases and these workloads have bubbled up and forced a lot of focus on that, which I think will, in the long run, be a very good thing for the community because it's a next level of maturity, right? We're solving really difficult problems now with respect to these pieces of infrastructure.
I've been summarizing exactly what you said. You said it more eloquently, and the summary that I've been saying is 2 years ago at KubeCon, we got our first AI announcements, and it was more like, hey, look, this works on Docker. This works on Kubernetes. You can actually do this in containers. It was more like proving that it would function. And now it's like, oh, we did all that, and we need to manage it better. We got hardware failures happening. We've got queues that need to be better managed, and we've got teams that need to share their, because GPUs are so scarce, we've now got to manage those resources so much better. So now we're getting tighter tools that really have to dial into the seconds of that GPU is idle for a couple of seconds. Let's shove something else in it.
Yep.
Where we didn't make Kubernetes has not been historically the fastest to execute everything everywhere. As soon as something fails, you have a few seconds, not minutes, but you have a few seconds before things start to heal and do stuff. And now it feels like with GPUs, every second counts.
Correct. And the end users and like all of us as platform engineers are much more sensitive to the performance, squeezing the value out of the compute and the infrastructure that you're having.
Yeah.
Also, just as a side note, we're also, because of that, looping in a different persona than typical, which is like the data engineer, the machine learning engineer, the data scientists.
Right.
Those folks are now represented more here at this because that's what the platform is for now.
Yeah.
Right? It's like those type of folks, they're doing, Jupyter notebooks at scale and experiments and MLOps.
And it sounds like, again, we're learning that not everybody wants to touch Kubernetes, including all of the scientists.
And they just want to run their training or
it feels, yeah, exactly. And it feels like we're now also creating the tools to layer that abstraction a little bit better so they don't have to be, also Kubernetes admin and ops, just so they can run ML workloads. Because we shout out to the ML ops. Was it Marvelous ML ops? Mike Task and Nick came on the show earlier this year. Maybe learned a little bit about ML ops on the show, which I have not had to do before, so that's something new for me.
And that's definitely a big theme for this KubeCon.
Yeah.
And I will probably be a core theme moving forward in KubeCon, subsequent KubeCons.
Yeah.
And the last thing, with respect to the, squeezing out performance and dealing with large infrastructure, Karpenter is an alternative to cluster autoscaler. It's a CNCF project and just hit V1 earlier this year. There was a joint AWS Microsoft workshop on Karpenter that had 600 attendees was to learn how to use that to make better use of your infrastructure and scale and upgrade. And so that's another big theme here around managing infrastructure at scale. Right? As a platform team, how are you responding to your leadership asking you, hey, I'm spending this much money, or I got to meet these needs of the new machine learning data scientists, and also the needs of my web apps and other apps. So how do I make sure that we're doing the right mix of infrastructure? And so, check out the Karpenter project. It was a lot of talk about it here at KubeCon. There's a provider for AWS and Azure, and hopefully other providers in the future, but it's a full CNCF SIG auto-scaling project.
We're gonna actually skip security. We'll put that in a separate one because that could be a whole, we could lump security and networking together. They kind of go hand in hand. I feel like we could do a whole other show on it.
Absolutely.
But this one, I don't want to exhaust people, and we've covered that's the thing about this conference. We could have a whole series. People would be so sick of us talking about KubeCon because we now have more KubeCons than ever. They're coming to Japan.
Yeah.
India is next month.
London.
China. What are we up to now? So yearly we're going to have 5. We got US, Europe, China, Japan. I'm missing one. India. So Australia, is that going to be this? 5 a year. Maybe they'll do Australia some year, but maybe Australia can go up to Japan.
Yeah.
But
in addition to more KCDs as well.
Yeah.
The Kubernetes community days.
So there's a lot of those.
Yeah.
Those we have multiple ones around the US. I don't know about Europe yet, but I hear about them all the time, different pockets of the US.
I think that's if there's another takeaway, it's 10 years into this, sorry. We used to say Kubernetes was hard.
Yeah.
I would say that Kubernetes is complex, but it is easier in a lot of ways.
For sure.
And those are two different things. And maybe I'll take on the persona of representing the larger scale, and maybe you can take on I agree with you completely that
we need each other.
Exactly. Anything that we do to help the reliability at scale helps anyone with a 4-node cluster. Yeah, and that reliability is something that you can get.
And when you make it simple for a 4-node cluster with three management nodes, four regular nodes, when you make it easier for those people, it tends to benefit the people at scale anyway. So you need both yin and yang there, and I think that's great.
Cool.
All right, I'm going to see you next time.
Yes.
We're going to take off.
Bye.
Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.